Well, Don, thank you so much for joining me in this episode of Lynch with a Leader. It is an honor to have you.
Well, Mike, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Anybody that has a backdrop like yours, I am all in to jump in and do these calls.
Well, listen, I feel the same way about yours. I'm wanting to get through the screen and take a look at all this memorabilia behind you. It really, though, we were saying this before we jumped on the call. What's behind you is just more than stuff you've collected. What does that room mean to you that's behind you?
Well, it's a reflection of a journey. It's gifts from a lot of people. Walter Payton, who I lived with for the last few weeks of his life as he was battling cancer, and he and I wrote a book together. Gave me a jersey that hangs over my shoulder. Shaquille O'Neal, one of my favorite people on the planet, took a pair of shoes off one day after playing a game and just handed me the shoes. You get a size 23 and a half. You can't have that very often over your shoulder. Warwick Dunn, we were talking about him. Warwick and I got to go to prison and visit the man that killed his mother. And I got to witness maybe the most amazing thing I think I've ever seen in my life. And just all of them are every bit of it. I play basketball, love basketball, and Coach K invites me to his old man basketball camp every year. And a couple of years ago, they retired my jersey. I think they were trying to tell me to quit, but
It was their kind way of saying, okay, it's about time,
look.
Don.
In fact, when they said they want to retire my jersey, they made me take it off. That was bad. No, it's a reflection of all the different things. The Blue Angels, which mean a lot. I do some work with them, and different. Anyway, it's a wonderful opportunity to kind of just throw a few things back there that mean something and gives me something to talk about every once in a while.
Is there a part of you that looks back there and feels like you've lived 10 lives? Is it hard to even get your arms around all the experiences you've had?
Not really. I don't think that way. I think every day is just a blessing, right? And if you realize that who I get to work with today is just it's an opportunity. It's something that I wasn't. I mean, every day I wake up and think, golly, how crazy is this?
You are known for all your writing and all your publishing, but it was sort of an accident that got you in, that you discovered this gift that God had uniquely put inside you. Unpack that story a little bit. This is a fantastic story of how God used something that may have seemed to be an accident to get you in the lane you were created for.
Thank you. It is funny. My father was a Methodist preacher. I think you may know that, and so I was born and raised in Hawaii. Lived for a couple of years when I between the ages 11 and 13. He did some work in Japan, Okinawa, Japan. So as a freshman in high school, we're moving as a family to Indianapolis, Indiana. Not the career, not the trajectory most people travel: Hawaii,
No.
Japan, Indianapolis, right? Not really. And I show up for school freshman year, and because I'd spent so much of my life as a kid around military families, I kind of thought the military might be my future. I signed up for ROTC at my high school, and the night before school was to start, the counselor called and said not enough kids signed up for ROTC, so they canceled the program at my high school. But they were dispersing us, putting us in different classes, and she had me. She was going to put me on the student newspaper, and I mean, no reason to do that, and out of that, I literally found a career. So you could, if you believe in providence as I do, you realize I wasn't meant to go to the military, though I would have loved it and been honored to do it. I was meant to find my space, and I did.
How quickly did you begin to discover, I think this is more than just a school newspaper? There's
Almost,
something else.
almost right from the beginning. I
Really?
realized what it did for me. Journalism for me satisfies my innate curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a highly curious person. I love to ask questions. I will ask questions of anyone and everyone I meet. My wife, it drives her crazy when we're in a cab and I've got to know the cabbie's story before we get out. And but I being in the world of journalism, which is, even though it was a student newspaper, it was a small time opportunity for me to. I realized I was gifted with the ability to write a few words, but more importantly, I was gifted in being able to draw from other people their stories.
And the lane of journalism and sports really came together for you because you had a passion and you played high school sports.
Right.
Did
Yep.
you know pretty early on after the sports career ended that you wanted to try to stay in that sports sphere of life?
I did, but I had a diversion for a little while. Mike, I live in Tallahassee, Florida, in part because my last job in the newspaper world before I went to Sports Illustrated I was the political editor of a newspaper in Jacksonville, Florida.
How about that?
All the political editors live in the state capital, Tallahassee, and all the political editors of all the papers in Florida live in Tallahassee. And so I moved here as a political editor, worked in that role for a couple of years, and then got an opportunity to go to Sports Illustrated, and they don't care where you live as long as you can be on an airplane 200 days a year. So that's what I did for 12 years.
What years were you with Sports Illustrated?
I was there 96 through 2008.
How about that?
Yeah. One of my first assignments was the bombing at the Olympics in Atlanta. Yeah, the Centennial Park.
My dad's company printed Sports Illustrated.
Oh, no
so
kidding.
That was one of the benefits of my dad's job was he would always bring home before it got mailed out. I would get the copy before it came home. Oh, it was wonderful, man. And those were the heydays of magazines, man. Those were the heydays. What did you learn from that experience at Sports Illustrated? What was something that you put into your leadership capital that you may not have been able to get anywhere else?
Well, so as I said, there are only 30 writers for Sports Illustrated in the whole world. They don't care where you live, just long as you're. But the other thing I loved about it was these were 30 of the most gifted humans, right? Well, 29 plus me, that you could ever be in the presence of if you appreciated what I did for a living. Mm-hmm. I got a chance to work with 29 people that were in my space, just, everything they did was gold. And I got to work with them every day and study them and ask questions and grow because I was in the presence of talent. But the other thing I loved about it was there was zero jealousy there, and which is not normal in the world of journalism. In the world of journalism, if you are at a newspaper and I got a really good assignment, your immediate sense was, man, that should have been mine. And there's a lot of jealousy at newspapers, but for whatever reason at this magazine, I experienced none of that. It was 29 people and myself on a regular basis, just cheering for each other. And you realize there was this, but a lot of it had to do with the confidence. Everyone there knew they were really good, No one was battling to try to figure out, am I as good as these other folks? And because of that, what I learned was, I learned to appreciate and be that person that could appreciate other people's talent. And too often in our world, we're busy competing, and we're busy. The only way for us to compete is to downgrade someone else, right?
That's right.
Not to upgrade us. So
who's somebody that shaped you? Who's somebody that shaped you in that world? Who was one of the other writers, or maybe somebody that you reported to in that world that you say was an incredibly powerful influence in helping you become who you are today?
Well, I would say there were many, but one that I always loved to even still today, I chat with him when I'm in his town, is Rick Riley, who was he owned the back page of the magazine. But it wasn't just that he was fantastic with words. That's all. everybody had that gift in that world. He was fantastic with the way he went about getting those words. One of my favorite moments was there was a golfer, and now I'm going to draw a blank. Casey, he was the golfer that had the withered leg. He golfed with Tiger Woods in college at Stanford. Wow. Was trying to make his way onto the PGA Tour, but he needed a golf cart in order to be able to play, because he was disabled. He was disabled, and Casey it became a big story because the United States Supreme Court was weighing in on whether or not the PGA's rules, which said you cannot golf if you require any assistance, right, were fair under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I just remember everybody in the world was trying to weigh in with their opinion on whether or not this guy got a competitive advantage by getting to ride a golf cart as opposed to walk. And Rick Riley went and said and asked Casey if he could be his caddy for a couple of days. Wow. He said, "Let me carry your bag because I want to know what it's like to be with you." Right. And then on the end of the first day together, Rick looks at him and says, "Hey, by the way, your hotel room, does it have one bed or two?" It's like, that's kind of weird, right? And Casey said, "Well, it has two beds." And Rick says, "Would you mind if I stayed in your room? I want to know what it's like to be you." And then that night, they're sitting in the hotel room, two men sitting in beds across from each other, both wearing gym shorts. And there's the withered leg there that was the center of this entire debate. And Rick Riley asked him, "Can I touch the leg? I want to know what it feels like."
Holy cow.
And you're thinking, all that could be extraordinarily weird, and for a lot of people is extraordinarily weird. But Rick Riley had a sense of what this young man was going through that none of the rest of those people offering opinions had. Why? Because he dared to ask one more question. And when you realize that's the kind of gift that he was able to play through the things that he was willing to do and educate many of us in a way that was just fantastic. And I just remember having great conversations with Rick about that entire setting and understanding, ask one more question. If you're willing to put yourself out there and ask one more question, who knows what the world may allow you to learn.
Is that something you've grown in through the years, going from being a young writer to now you've got 35 books? Is that right?
And that's scary. That's
crazy. That's unbelievable.
I know.
It is the power of the question something you've grown in as a leader through the years? Without
question. I think that's the thing. I made reference earlier to Warwick Dunn. And I'll share with you, I got the opportunity to write Warwick's book, and some of your listeners may know Warwick played in the NFL for a number of years, but he his mother was a police officer, was shot and killed in a robbery at a bank when Warwick was 18 years old, senior in high school. Goes to college, raises his three younger brothers and sisters, goes to the NFL. When he goes to the NFL, he starts a charity buying homes for women like his mom. 548 children woke up in a house this morning that they got to call their own because of Warwick Dunn. Like, that's how extraordinary this young man is. So he wins the Walter Payton Man of the Year award, gets a chance to write a book, asked me if I'd write it with him. And as we're moving toward the end of the book, the last interview schedule is right here in this office. And Warwick sits down. And I said, "Warwick, if I've read all the stories about the man who was convicted of killing your mother. And it's amply noted that in all those stories that back then, every time he walked into a courtroom, you got up and walked out immediately. And back then, I understand why, because you didn't want to breathe the same air as somebody could do something like that. I get it. But today, you've been through counseling to deal with the challenges of what that whole situation has meant to you. Warwick, if that man were to walk in and sit down with us today, what kind of questions would you ask him? What kind of things would you say? Now, that's not a question you ask most people, right? But it was because I learned over the course of time how to be able to draw that question out of, think of a question like that. Warwick got up. He said, "Man, I'm not ready for that question." And he left my office. But he came back 2 days later and he handed me a notebook filled with questions.
Wow.
He would ask the man if he could ever meet him. And as it happened in those 2 days, a friend of mine from Louisiana had called. I told him about Warwick leaving the office, how awkward I felt. My friend said, "That's interesting. There's a law in Louisiana that if you're the victim of a crime that leads the perpetrator to death row and you fill out certain paperwork, the Louisiana Department of Corrections will expedite a meeting between victim and inmate because they want the victims to find closure." So Warwick hands me this series of questions in this notebook, and I reach around and I hand him the article and tell him, "By the way, look at this. You could actually go ask those questions. Louisiana has a law that would allow you to do that." And Warwick was like, "Whoa, I mean, yeah, I'm not ready for that." And he came back 3 days later and he said, "Let's go to Louisiana. I want to ask the questions."
Jeez.
And Warwick and I and his high school coach went to Angola State Prison, to death row, to meet the guy that killed his mom. And at the end of this hour together, Warwick looked at him and said, "Sir, I came here today to forgive you." It's the most extraordinary thing I've ever witnessed a human being do, right? It's greater than any Super Bowl I've ever been to, any World Cup you could ever go to. It's the single greatest moment. And we left that prison, and I asked Warwick, and the warden actually said to Warwick, "Young man, one day we're going to execute this guy. And when we do, would you want to be here?" And Warwick looked at him and said, "No, because as of today, he holds no power over me." Forgiveness had given Warwick that freedom. Forgiveness doesn't happen if I hadn't had the opportunity to ask that question. Forgiveness, I mean, all of those things, you realize it was a question that changed his life, my life, the inmate's life. I mean, and so if we learn to ask great questions, if we can be engaged with others with great questions, we can, as Rick Riley did by asking if he could touch the thigh, right? You can change the course of history if you just ask the right questions.
You said it a second ago that you believe in providence. You believe there's a greater plan, which I do too. And I don't believe God wastes any of our time on life in this world. I believe that I have one good friend. He says, when coincidences are when God just chooses to remain anonymous and our lives intersect these other lives. What's better in Don Yaeger's life because you met, let's just take now Warwick Dunn. What by meeting him changed about you? What would you say?
Well, I mean, I without question, I mean, I won't ever say I'm perfect at it, but I got better at offering grace in moments that I would previously have argued grace. I didn't want to do that, right? Because it wasn't requested. If they didn't ask for forgiveness, I mean, this inmate wasn't asking Warwick to forgive him. Warwick just offered it, and so I think I got a little bit better at that. I more than anything, I think the other thing that's better for me is that I was reminded again. I had the opportunity to tell that story in a book. It's been featured on all kinds of public. I tell it often when I speak out in corporate audiences. Warwick was a podcast guest of mine. We've talked about podcasting here, in which he and I dug into it. It's a really great podcast. Maybe one of my favorite episodes and so I probably, the other thing where I would say I'm better is that I've had the opportunity to engage a number of other people who have learned to forgive because they heard Warwick's story.
That's right.
Right? They heard Warwick do something that the average person just does not, most people do not do, and it inspired them. I've gotten letters over the years, many of them, from people. You know what? I went to prison and forgave somebody for a drunk driving accident that did damage, changed my family. And you know, I can think of a bunch of those letters, and the opportunity to tell that story changed the direction of a lot of other people's lives.
You know, the Walter Payton jersey that hangs behind you, and you getting to spend that time with him, Sweetness, probably the best running back that's ever put a jersey on an NFL field. What did you learn about Walter Payton? Most people would never know. Everybody saw the player. Yeah. During your time getting ready for his book, what did you learn about him most people would never know?
Well, first off, he was a better man than he was a player, and he was the greatest player ever, right? So I had a chance to witness his heart in the way that even in his own frailty, right, in his own weak moments, he was trying to figure out how he could deliver on commitments and promises to other people, which was really incredible. Also had a really incredible experience in all of that. During one of the days that I was with him, I remember one day, again, talk about questions, right? I said, Walter, you know, you've first ballot Hall of Famer, Super Bowl champion, MVP of the league, rushing champion, and you know, at the time held the record for most yards ever achieved by a running back in the NFL. If you could trade all of that for one day in the future, what would the day be? Mm-hmm. And at the time, Walter's little girl, Brittany, was 13 years old. And Walter did not miss a beat. He looked at me and he said, I would trade it all to walk my daughter down the aisle. And he proceeded to take much of the next 30 to 45 minutes, I don't even remember how long it was, to tell me how he imagined that day being, what it was going to be like when his daughter got married. Now I'm writing Walter's book. At the time, you know, he was not going to be alive when the book came out. He was dying, and we knew it, and it was going to happen before I would ever get a chance to finish the book. But he trusted me, told me the story, and I looked at it and I realized I couldn't include it in the book because no 13-year-old little girl should know right. that was what her dad was thinking about as he was dying. So I held on to all of that, never shared it with anybody. 15 years later, I get a call from Brittany. She's getting married. And I said, Brittany, I got something for you. Mm-hmm. And I had a chance to go sit down with her and share with her what her dad would say to her on the day she got married. Turned into one of the greatest moments I've ever experienced, and only happened because I asked a question.
That's right. You know, and I've heard you talk about your time with John Wooden, the legendary UCLA basketball coach, who so many have built leadership principles around, life around, and you ended up meeting him and then called him later about getting together. And he was just waiting on you to ask. He was just waiting on you to reach out to him. And how many years? Y'all spend 12 years together?
12 years, every other month for 12 years. I flew to California to spend a day with him. I had 500 hours of recorded conversation with John Wooden.
Best leadership lesson you learned from John Wooden? What was the most impactful thing you got from your time with him?
He regularly shared with me that I would be, my entire life would be defined by who I chose to give my time to. He said, you are, everything about, and he said, it's not who you wish you gave your time to, it's who you do give your time to.
Wow.
And he said, so don't talk to me about, don't tell me that the people that are central in your life are the people you imagine you're with. Actually calculate the hours and tell me who you spending your time with.
Mm.
And he said, you will never outperform those people. And that if you want to be better, always be improving the circle of people you put around you.
How did that shape you? What would be different about you if you hadn't met John Wooden?
Well, I would tell you, to this day, once a year, I pick a weekend and a city, and I have a group of people. As it happens, all of them are men, because that's who has had the greatest impact on my life. A group of people who meet me away for a weekend, that is, generically called the circle of greatness, right?
I love it. I love it.
And we get together because the influence they showed into my life, I want them to show into each other's life as well. And so how am I different as a result of that? I mean, I'm constantly monitoring my circle, constantly growing it, constantly trying to invest into the people who are invested in me. I am, it's, the group and I were just together a few weeks ago, more than a couple of months ago in Chicago. I took them to go see a Chicago Cubs game, and spent time with David Ross, the manager of the Cubs, with whom I also wrote a book. And I just spent the weekend, pouring into each other, and it was a really incredible, no agenda, no financial condition, right? It is just a group of people who all share certain common interests, but more importantly, they all know that they're better based upon the people they have around them.
That's so good. I was speaking, it was funny, I was speaking at a leadership event today, and my last point of the outline was about knowing your why. And I said, oh, it's so funny. I've got a podcast today with a gentleman. That's a big part of his book, is these great companies know their why. And I had a guy walk up after it was over, and he said, I heard Don on Entree Leadership with John Maxwell, and he was talking about David Ross. And I'm glad you brought that up. And he said, ask him how to be valuable without being the most valuable.
Right.
What, and that was great. I'm like, absolutely. I will write that down. That is great stuff. So what would be your answer to that?
So the story is that David Ross, he was a catcher in the major leagues, right? Obviously caught for your Braves there for a while. But in fact, his life made a great change there in Atlanta. He was, his previous stop, he played for 7 teams over 15 years, but his previous stop to Atlanta was the Cincinnati Reds, where he was catching for Dusty Baker, and he was a starter. It was the only time in his career he was a starting catcher, and Dusty Baker cut him from the team. Even though he was the starter, he cut him because he said, you're okay on the field, but you're bad in the locker room. You care more about your statistics, the condition of your professional career, than you care about the team. And we don't need that. We don't need that in our locker room. And he cut his starting catcher. David Ross ended up in Atlanta in his next year, the next season. And when he was there, he decided, you know what? No one's ever going to call me a bad teammate ever again. Because that was what Dusty Baker called him. He said, you're a bad teammate. He said, no one's ever going to use those 2 words to describe me again. And so he began a journey in which he started asking everybody that came through the locker room, Mike, tell me about the best teammate you ever had, and give me 3 words to describe why they were such a good teammate. What did they do that made them such a good teammate? And he built a list of what it meant to become a great teammate. And then over the course of building that list, he turned that list into a checklist for himself. And every day before he took the field, he went through the list and said, today I will be and he did each one of, he committed himself to being the best teammate he could be. And over the course of the next 4 years while he was in Atlanta as a backup catcher, he developed a reputation as the best teammate in baseball. He was always there on the top step of the dugout when you came off the field to give you a high five and acknowledge something you did out on the field. Even when he wasn't playing, he was fully engaged with his teammates. And his reputation changed. And ultimately, he got the chance to continue on his career in Boston, where he won a World Series with the Red Sox, and Chicago, where he won a World Series with the Cubs. And in the very last game of his career, 15 years in the major leagues, 7th game of the World Series, in his last at bat as a professional baseball player, David Ross hit a home run to help the Cubs win the World Series. And when the game was over, the players carried one player off the field on their shoulders, and it was David Ross, because he had made himself invaluable without ever being most valuable.
That's so good. That is so good.
He was never even the best catcher on his baseball team, but he made himself invaluable to those around him by being a servant leader. And that's who David Ross was. It gave him, it doubled the length of his career. It won him 2 World Series championships. And he's just an extraordinary man because of that, because he has that, he understands you don't have to be the best to make other people better.
That is such a great segue, because I think so many times we think, well, to be great, you're always talking about greatness. To be great, I always have to be the best. But that's not true, is it?
No,
how would you even define the word greatness?
So it's funny. Greatness, I argue that it has a different definition to everyone. I also argue that greatness is it's a pursuit. It's not a it's not an end. It's not an end game, right? I will never achieve greatness, but I will always be chasing it. And so if I understand that, what it means is it's a constant improvement. It's a thirst for learning. It's a desire to ask questions of other people. It is not just simply professional either. It is, I want to be the best father. I want my kids to want to introduce me to their friends, not because their friends think I'm famous, but because my kids know I love them, right? And if I can be all of those things, if I can be the best husband, if I can work to be all of those things, I'm chasing greatness. And that's what greatness is to me. It's really, it's a lifestyle.
Do you find that as you get older? So when you're the young, hungry reporter at Sports Illustrated, starting your career, now you're we're not going to say old, savvy veteran,
I'm
right?
old.
No,
I get it.
Listen, we're aging well, man. We're aging well. I'm with you. So we're savvy veterans now. Do you find this pursuit something you even have to think about more now than you even did early? Tell me about that a little bit.
Actually not, because now it's almost in my gene pool.
That's good.
Right now it's like I wake up ready. I don't have to psych myself into trying to be ready. I so tell myself all the time, what am I doing today? What am I doing today? How am I getting better? Where's better coming from in this schedule today? Who am I pouring into? Who's pouring into me? Because I constantly think that way, it's not even, it's completely second nature.
It's really good. Even as you look back to childhood, you were raised by a Methodist minister, right?
Yes.
What did your dad do well, shaping you to who you are today?
He was the greatest storyteller I ever met. He was
really
fantastic. Yeah. But he used to tell me all the time. And so it's funny because now I teach a course on storytelling for Simon Sinek, right? Who is the guy that we talked about, Start With Why.
Yep.
Our buddy John Maxwell calls me the best storyteller he's ever worked with. And I love telling stories,
Mm,
and
mm.
my father taught me how to be a storyteller. He taught me the habits,
Mm.
the good storytelling, and it's not a formula. Storytelling is not formulaic, as some people want it to be. And
Yep.
insert hero here, and here's the journey, you know, here's the sacrifice. Storytelling is it's built around a series of habits, and I work on them all the time. On how do I how do I draw other people into conversation through story.
Mm. You even look back at Jesus's life, and now he was the master storyteller. Everything was a story, wasn't it?
So that was what my father used to say. And, and again, today you probably can't say this. I don't know if I should say this, but he said back then, he said, the beauty of it, he said, among the greatest storytellers of all time are Jesus Christ and Adolf Hitler,
Yep.
right?
That's right.
Storytelling uh, gets large numbers of people to go do incredible things, not always good.
That's right.
And so be careful about the story you tell. And, but it's true that storytelling it's the magnet, right? It is the draw, and those who do it well um, have the capacity to bring others with them.
You have rubbed shoulders with so many great people.
And
We're
today I got Mike Linch. It's good.
listen, and
I got it.
we've got to have a low bar to make the high bar seem important, right? I mean, that's very important. So I'm not going to get to the teams piece, because this is that I want to sink in on the people piece of this. You've rubbed shoulders from Coach K
Mm,
to one-on-one with Michael Jordan
mm.
to Walter Payton and Warwick Dunn and David Ross and Shaquille O'Neal. What are things that they were all doing very different things at very different eras and times? But what's and John Wooden, what are two or three things these greats had in common that you would never expect them to have had in common?
Well, the number one answer I'd give you to that is that they, at some stage in their life, they learned to hate losing more than they love winning.
How about that?
That winning, for most of those who are pretty good at what they do, winning is almost it's the expected outcome, right? It's not a
Mm-hmm.
surprise, doesn't give them a thrill, doesn't make them cry. Winning is what they expect. Losing hurts.
Mm-hmm.
You take Nick Saban. One of my favorite lines from Nick, whenever he and I have been together, is he talks about never wasting a loss.
Mm.
Right? Never waste a good loss. That's his line, and I love it. Right? He never wait. There's learning to be had, and unfortunately, it's hard. Um, it's hard to teach the successful.
Yeah.
Because they begin to get a little full of themselves, a little overly comfortable, confident. Fortunately, sometimes the only time we really get a chance to learn is in a good loss. And so, does losing hurt?
Mm. Mm.
And anyway, it's so that's number one. And I'll tell you, I mean, to where we are today, I mean, I don't know if you know this, I'm doing Deion Sanders' book right now. I'm writing Deion's book.
Wow.
And he and I was with him last week in Boulder, and I mean, we had an entire conversation on this exact subject. That if losing has to hurt,
Mm.
or you're not going to learn something from it.
Wow.
And if you can excuse it, if you can if you can blame somebody, if there's always an answer every time you don't get what you came for, you're not learning. If
That's
you're not
right.
learning, then it wasn't really it wasn't a good loss. And there can
Mm.
be good losses.
That's so good. That is so good. It's funny. I remember watching a Bear Grylls episode with Dion out. Oh, it was phenomenal. One of the best things I've ever watched. And Dion really unpacks his faith story
Oh,
sitting
it's
around a
incredible.
campfire. Bear Grylls is one of the best interviewers I've ever heard. And just the way he would get people to unpack stories. How common do you see faith playing a role in these great leaders' lives, in these
Without,
great athletes' lives?
so I put it in, the way I phrase it is that they have a sense of a higher, they believe in a higher power.
Mm.
They don't all share my faith. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and I have had amazing conversations about faith. We don't share the same, we don't worship the same God,
Mm-hmm.
but we both believe that there is a place for us in a universe that's created because there is there's a master source out there, and so I'm always really careful, because I want to be respectful of other
That's
people's
right.
faiths and beliefs. But I do find, Warwick Dunn, we talked about it, right? Doesn't share his faith openly, but he's a man of faith. Walter Payton, unbelievable, great. John Wooden was maybe one of the greatest
Oh
men of faith
man.
I've ever met, right? I mean, the guy is spectacular. Everything, he used to say all the time, he said, he said, I don't need to talk about my faith. He said, but if I were to ever be tried for it, I just want to make sure they can convict me, right?
Oh man.
It's such a good line. And yeah, I mean, everywhere I go, I mean, there's this belief that, many people think that the best always think of themselves as the center of the universe. Not true.
Mm-mm.
They recognize that, it, none of it matters if there isn't something bigger out there.
Mm. I know you've got a family that's super precious to you, and you've got lots of followers, people that love you from a distance, that read your work. I can't wait to read your book on Dion. I mean, it doesn't matter. Listen, I do all these leadership groups with men, and
Yeah.
from athletic leaders to civic leaders to police leaders, everybody's talking about Dion. It's sort of the talk right now.
I
It's
know. I argue that, like, the two greatest names in sports today are Deion Sanders and Taylor Swift. I mean, like, you know,
it's true though.
that's right. If you
It
can't have a conversation with one of those two in the conversation, you're not talking about sports today,
It
right?
is crazy. And
Yep.
everybody's fascinated. Everybody's
Yep.
fascinated with it. And they know him for different things. And of course, he's an Atlanta icon from his years with the Falcons and the Braves and throwing water on Tim McCarver. I mean, that was one of his moments
Low,
there,
low, low moments.
one of his low moments during the
Yeah.
years. You know, when you think of Don Yaeger's life, the Bible says this about King David. He said he lived his purpose in his generation, and then he was done. It's one of the greatest lines in all of Scripture. He
Mm,
fell asleep. I
mm,
believe God knits us all together for a purpose bigger than us. What do
mm.
you believe was the purpose that God created Don Yaeger for, that he may not have created anybody else for?
Mm. I would probably say, um, to be the eyes and ears that helped some pretty extraordinary people share their story with the world in a way that they may not have been able to without the relationship.